In our headlines on this Thursday, April 23rd, here in South Korea, President Lee Jae-myung continues his diplomatic agenda in Hanoi, meeting with leaders there to expand cooperation areas of bilateral interest for mutual gain. Meanwhile, the White House rejects reports of a deadline in the recently extended ceasefire by US President Donald Trump, claiming he has yet to dictate a fixed timeline. And here on the local front, the Korean economy posted its strongest quarterly growth in over 5 years in the first quarter of this year, driven by private spending and overseas shipments. We start over in Hanoi yet again, this time with a recap of Wednesday's summit between President Lee Jae-myung and his Vietnamese counterpart Do Lam. Our top office correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
President Lee Jae-myung, who is on a state visit to Hanoi, was given a red carpet welcome by Do Lam, Vietnam's top political leader. The friendly mood was reflected in Wednesday's summit.
당 서기장께서는 지난해 우리 정부 출범 후에 첫 번째 국빈으로 방한하셨고 또 이번 저의 베트남 방문은 베트남의 새 지도부 출범 후 2주 만에 이루어진 베트남의 첫 국빈 방문으로.
Your visit, Mr. President, clearly shows our comprehensive strategic partnership that is based upon strong, effective, and deep trust.
Amid the current tensions in the Middle East, the Korean president said Korea and Vietnam will work together on energy and infrastructure based on profound mutual trust.
최근 중동 상황에서 비롯된 공급망 불안정성 속에서 양국 간 협력의 필요성이 더욱 커졌다는 데 공감하였습니다. 에너지 안보 강화와 공급망 안정을 위해 더욱 긴밀히 협력하기로.
A dozen MOUs were signed on energy, infrastructure, and technology, including power infrastructure and nuclear power plants.
Vietnam welcomes Korean companies expanding investment in areas such as infrastructure, smart cities, semiconductors, large-scale AI data centers, nuclear power plants, smart ports, and next-generation ports.
The two countries plan to cooperate on the Ho Chi Minh City Metro Railway, with South Korea's Hyundai Rotem set to play a major part in this $110 million project. Korean firms are also eyeing urban development and airport projects in Vietnam. By 2030, Seoul and Hanoi aim to expand their annual bilateral trade to $150 billion. The two countries signed an MOU to allow exports of heat-treated poultry products, to expand cooperation on agricultural and food products. People-to-people exchanges was also on the agenda.
상대국 국민과 다문화 가정의 안정적인 체류와 권익 증진을 위해 긴밀하게 협력해 나가기로 하였습니다.
We also have agreed to share experiences on culture and entertainment industries, such as film, music, and gaming, and bolster mutual support.
It was the two leaders' second engagement in about 8 months, following the Vietnamese leader's trip to Korea last August. The South Korean president's reciprocal visit to Vietnam so early in his presidency is seen as carrying symbolic significance in terms of Seoul's strategic priorities. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News, Hanoi.
And following his summit with his Vietnamese counterpart, President Jae-myung on this Thursday also sat down with other senior members of the Vietnamese leadership to pledge broader partnership. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yu-jin reports.
Continuing its diplomatic push in Vietnam, President Lee Jae-myung on Thursday held a series of high-level meetings with the country's number 2 and number 3 officials. Lee first met with Prime Minister Lee Min-hung, who oversees the country's economy and administration. Talks focused on deepening economic cooperation, with President Lee presenting South Korea as a reliable partner in supporting Vietnam's rapid growth.
과거에 한국은 원전을 통한 에너지 자립, 고속도로 및 철도를 통한 물류 혁신, 그리고 투명한 금융 결제 시스템이라는 3가지 핵심 인프라에 집중 투자했습니다. 이러한 물리적, 제도적 토대의 결합이야말로 한국이 단기간에 경제 도약을 이뤄낸 결정적 엔진이었습니다.
Vietnam is pursuing strategic breakthroughs in policy, human resources, and infrastructure, while placing the private sector at the center of economic growth. We hope South Korea will work together with us in supporting these efforts.
Prime Minister Lee Min-hung also invited South Korea's Prime Minister Kim Min-seok to visit Vietnam, with President Lee saying he would convey the invitation and work to arrange the visit soon. Lee later met with National Assembly Chairman Chun Ting-mun, Vietnam's top legislator, where he emphasized the role of Parliament in furthering Seoul and Hanoi's comprehensive strategic partnership.
양국 간 협력이 제도적으로 뒷받침될 수 있도록 양국 의회 간의 교류도 더욱 활성화되기를 기대합니다. 베트남 내 우리 국민의 권익 증진과 한국 기업들의 경영 활동 개선을 위해서도 국회에 지속적인 관심과 지원을 부탁드립니다.
This marks President Lee's first visit to Vietnam since taking office, and the first state visit since Vietnam's 16th National Assembly completed forming its new leadership. It reflects the high importance Vietnam places on its relationship with President Lee, the South Korean government, and South Korea.
As these meetings come just weeks after Vietnam's new administration took office, they are seen as efforts to set a positive tone for bilateral ties in the years ahead. 송유진, 아리랑 뉴스.
Over in the U.S., the White House has contradicted claims of a deadline in the recently extended ceasefire by the U.S. Our Moon Hye-ryun explains.
The White House says President Donald Trump is in no rush to lock in a timeline for negotiations with Iran, despite reports suggesting otherwise. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters on Wednesday there is no firm deadline for Tehran to submit what the U.S. has called a unified proposal, dismissing claims of a 3 to 5 day window as inaccurate.
The president has not set a deadline himself. Ultimately, he will dictate the timetable.
According to Fox News, Trump has also rejected the idea of any time pressure, saying the ceasefire extension will remain in place as long as needed while talks continue. Instead, officials say the timeline will ultimately be determined by the president, as Washington waits for clarity from what it describes as a divided Iranian leadership, split between pragmatists and hardliners. While direct military strikes have paused under the ceasefire, the broader pressure campaign has not. The White House says its naval blockade and economic measures remain fully in force, targeting Iran's oil exports and shipping routes. Leavitt described the blockade as a key source of leverage, claiming it is inflicting significant economic damage and limiting Iran's ability to move oil through its main export hub. Even as negotiations stall, U.S. officials argue this strategy is strengthening their position, with Trump reportedly viewing the ongoing economic squeeze as more effective than continued bombardment. But beneath a diplomatic standoff, a more complex and potentially long-lasting challenge is emerging in the Strait of Hormuz. According to the Washington Post, Pentagon officials have warned lawmakers that clearing sea mines laid by Iran could take up to 6 months and may not even begin until the war formally ends. The report, based on a classified congressional briefing, suggests more than 20 mines may have been deployed, some using GPS technology that makes them harder to detect. That assessment raises concerns that disruptions to one of the world's most critical oil routes could persist well beyond any ceasefire agreement. Moon Hye-ryun, Arirang News.
And in an open display of defiance, Iran has seized 2 ships in the Strait of Hormuz, but the Trump administration appears to be shrugging off the incident. Our Lee Soo-jin has details.
Iran on Wednesday fired on 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz and seized 2 of them, marking a sharp escalation in tensions along one of the world's most critical shipping routes. The attacks happened just a day after U.S. President Donald Trump extended a ceasefire while keeping an American naval blockade on Iranian ports in place. Iranian state media said the country's Revolutionary Guard is now escorting the seized ships into Iranian waters. The White House, however, said the action does not violate the current truce, noting the vessels were not American or Israeli. The latest incident adds to a growing pattern of maritime aggression. Since the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran began in late February, there have been more than 30 reported attacks on ships in the region. Prior to that, the Strait of Hormuz had remained open to international traffic. Despite the escalation, Iranian's President Masoud Pezeshkian signaled openness to diplomacy. In a social media post on Wednesday, he said Iran remains committed to resolving disputes through dialogue, but criticized what he called breaches of commitments and ongoing blockades, accusing Washington of contradictory actions. Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf also weighed in, saying a meaningful ceasefire cannot exist alongside maritime restrictions or continued military operations by Israel. He warned that the vital waterway could remain closed if ceasefire violations continue, raising concerns about further disruption to global energy supplies and trade. 이수진, 아리랑 뉴스.
In related news, a South Korean delegate to the Middle East recently met with the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi to address the plight of South Koreans in Iran and the fate of South Korean vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. Our foreign affairs correspondent Oh Soo-young covers their talks.
Seoul's diplomatic envoy to Tehran, Chung Byung-ah, has met with Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi to discuss the safety of Korean citizens and vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. The Foreign Ministry says the meeting was abruptly arranged and held on Wednesday in Tehran.
The special envoy's visit can be seen as part of our strengthened efforts to achieve a swift stabilization and restoration of peace in the Middle East. Second, it demonstrates our firm commitment to ensuring the safety of our nationals residing in Iran, as well as our vessels operating in the Strait. Lastly, it reflects our determination to maintain and further develop bilateral relations, even under these challenging circumstances.
The Korean envoy strongly requested Tehran's attention on the protection of Korean nationals in Iran. Araghchi said Iran would take continuous interest in the matter. Chung also raised the need to ensure free and safe passage of all vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, as over 24 Korean flagships remain in regional waters. The envoy further expressed hope that the resumption of negotiations between the United States and Iran would lead to the early restoration of peace and stability in the region. Araghchi expressed appreciation for South Korea sending an envoy even during difficult times, and the Korean embassy in Tehran continuing to operate despite the war. Both officials agreed on the importance of bilateral ties and the need to continue developing the relationship. Appointed as a special envoy of Foreign Minister Cho Hyun, Chung has been in Tehran for nearly 2 weeks, engaging with senior officials for political, economic and consular affairs.
Minister Cho has held 2 phone calls with Araghchi since the crisis broke out in late February. The Foreign Ministry says it will continue diplomatic communication with Tehran at various levels. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
In other news now, the conditions for the transfer of wartime operational control from the U.S. to South Korea are expected to be met by early 2029. Our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung reports.
South Korea and the U.S. aim to meet the required conditions for the transfer of wartime operational control to Seoul no later than the second quarter of the U.S. fiscal year 2029. This is according to remarks made on Wednesday local time by General Xavier Brunson, the U.S. Forces Korea commander, when answering a question from the U.S. House Armed Services Committee.
That right now we've delivered to OSW a roadmap which will get us there not later than second quarter of FY29. And we'll continue to pursue that. As you know, Chairman, we have the Korea Integrated Defense Dialogue that's upcoming, where a great many of these conditions will be discussed. We've also got the military consultative meeting and the security consultative meeting, which are also coming up to be held here in D.C. early in the fall.
The U.S. government's fiscal year 2029 runs from October 1st, 2028 to September 30th, 2029, meaning the Allies aim to meet the conditions between January through March 2029 for Korea's fiscal year. He also said South Korea is in a strong position for the transfer, with defense spending set to rise about 8.5% over the next 3 years. Regarding the commander's remarks, South Korea's defense ministry said Thursday that the timing of the OPCON transfer will be decided at the security consultative meeting before being submitted to both presidents for approval. Aside from OPCON transfer, the USFK also talked about designating South Korea as a regional sustainment hub to expand maintenance cooperation.
One thing I would like to mention as I go forward is our continued emphasis on things like a regional sustainment hub because of the importance of sustainment to the region.
Emphasizing how South Korea's defense industrial base has developed into one of the best in the world, Brunson underlined how the U.S. can alleviate the burden of distance by leveraging Korea's defense industry for MRO, or maintenance, repair, and overhaul. Regarding upgrades and maintenance, South Korea has already been supporting these domestically for U.S. military aircraft, such as F-16, F-15 fighter jets, and CH-47 Chinook helicopters since 1978, and the written statement hints at possible agreements regarding other assets, including Patriot missile systems, drones, and T-55 aircraft engines. He did, however, point out that this plan would require close coordination with the state and defense departments and congressional approval for special repair authority to allow some U.S. equipment to be serviced in Korea. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Findings for the first quarter of this year show the Korean economy posting its strongest quarterly growth in over 5 years, driven by private spending and overseas shipments. Our economics correspondent Kim Do-yeon has the latest numbers.
According to the Bank of Korea's advanced estimate on Thursday, the nation's real gross domestic product grew by 1.7% from the previous quarter. On a yearly basis, it's grown 3.6%. This significantly outperforms expectations and overcomes concerns over the situation in the Middle East, which severely hit South Korea's energy and petroleum sector. In fact, this quarter-on-quarter figure is nearly double the central bank's earlier projection of 0.9% and marks the highest growth rate since the third quarter of 2020.
To summarize the first quarter growth, private consumption acted as a pillar of support, while strong exports centered on semiconductors and investments to expand semiconductor production capacity drove the overall growth.
Looking closely at the data, the manufacturing sector expanded by 3.9%. Overall exports surged 5.1%, heavily fueled by global demand for information technology products. This resulted in net exports contributing 1.1 percentage points to the overall economic growth figure. Domestic demand also showed a solid recovery, adding 0.6 percentage points to the GDP. Facilities investment climbed 4.8% and construction investment rose 2.8%. Private consumption grew by 0.5%, supported by increased spending on goods like clothing. Additionally, real gross domestic income surged 7.5% on quarter. This marks the highest increase since the first quarter of 1988, indicating a significant expansion in the nation's purchasing power due to improved terms of trade. Meanwhile, the government attributed this strong performance to both favorable market conditions and active policy interventions.
In addition to strong exports driven by the semiconductor boom, policy effects such as capital market revitalization and consumption support measures contributed greatly. I also believe our swift response to the Middle East war played a part.
He added that as ceasefire negotiations are delayed and uncertainties remain high, the government will not let its guard down. Prior to this release, the Bank of Korea had projected an annual economic growth rate of 2.1% for the year. But with the positive surprise growth in the first quarter and the negative impact of the Middle East situation expected to become clearer in the second quarter, the public now waits to see which factor weighs the most on the annual growth rate. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, on the corporate front, SK hynix has staged an outstanding first quarter performance with dramatic gains in both revenue and operating profit. Our business correspondent Park Chun-an breaks down the numbers and more.
South Korean chip giant SK hynix on Thursday revealed its record quarterly performance. The company's revenue was 52.58 trillion won, or around $35.5 billion. A massive 198.1% jump from the same period last year. Operating profit saw an even more dramatic rise as it reached 37.61 trillion won, up 405.5% year-on-year. This marks the first time SK hynix has ever surpassed 50 trillion won in quarterly revenue and 30 trillion won in operating profit in a single quarter. From Thursday's record, the company has now set new all-time high earnings for 4 consecutive quarters, with the latest figure nearly double the previous operating profit of 19.17 trillion won set in the fourth quarter of 2025. What stood out was the company's operating margin, as it hit 72%, a level rarely seen in the industry and the highest in the company's history. The surge was driven by explosive demand for AI-related memory chips such as DRAM and NAND flash. Korean securities firms' estimates for the second quarter of 2026 point to revenue of around 69.5 trillion won and operating profit of 51.3 trillion won, which would extend the record-breaking streak to 5 straight quarters. Long-term supply agreements are increasing as customers lock in memory contracts amid ongoing shortages, and prices for both DRAM and NAND are forecast to keep rising. The company is also expected to resolve supply issues for its next-generation HBM4 to U.S. chip giant NVIDIA within the first half of the year. 박준환, 아리랑 뉴스.
Also on the local front, Finance Minister Koo Yoon-chul and Bank of Korea Governor Shin Hyun-sung held their first meeting on this Thursday following Shin's inauguration earlier this week. At a breakfast meeting, the two officials laid the groundwork for closer cooperation between their institutions. Shin warned that growth and inflation are moving in opposite directions, calling for a carefully crafted mix of monetary and fiscal policies. Koo, for his part, stressed the importance of close coordination in policymaking, particularly on the exchange front.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe. Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon on Wednesday killed at least 5 people, including a journalist, in the deadliest day since a 10-day ceasefire took effect. Lebanese journalist Ammar Khalil was killed when rescuers were blocked from reaching her after strikes hit the building she had taken cover in. Lebanon's prime minister called the obstruction of rescue efforts, quote, war crimes. Israel denied blocking any rescue operation and said it had targeted cars that had left a Hezbollah military structure. Lebanon's president said Thursday's talks with Israel will push for a ceasefire extension beyond its Sunday expiry. In the UK, any child aged 17 or younger today will never legally be able to buy a cigarette for the rest of their lives. UK lawmakers passed a landmark law on Wednesday that raises the legal smoking age by 1 year every year. This means anyone born on or after January 1st, 2009 faces a lifetime ban on purchasing tobacco. The law also bans vaping and nicotine product sales to under 18s and tightens advertising rules. The government says smoking kills around 64,000 people a year in England alone and costs the National Health Service £3 billion each year. The United States is expected to reclassify marijuana as a less dangerous drug. The decision at a federal level would reclassify cannabis at the same level as common painkillers. This follows an executive order signed by President Trump in December directing the loosening of federal marijuana regulations. Cannabis firms will also see lower tax burdens and find it easier to secure funding. Shares of major cannabis companies surged as much as 23% on the news. Chu Ji-hyun, 아리랑 뉴스.
We're in for a bright and sunny day tomorrow, perfect for getting out and enjoying some fresh air. But with a big day-to-night temperature swing of around 20 degrees, you may want to keep a jacket handy. Also, air quality will stay clean nationwide tomorrow, with fine dust levels ranging from good to moderate. Meanwhile, alerts have been expanding, with dry weather advisories now in place across parts of the central regions, including Seoul. There's also a strong wind advisory along the eastern coast of Gyeongsang-Bukdo province, so please take extra care. As for temperatures, Seoul will start the day at 8 degrees Celsius, Chuncheon at 5 degrees, Busan at 11 degrees. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 24 degrees along with Chuncheon and Daejeon. Looking ahead, we'll see plenty of sunshine tomorrow toward the end of the week, with temperatures gradually rising. There is no rain in the forecast through the weekend, so dry conditions will persist, along with those big day-to-night temperature swings.
Right, those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. As always, thank you for watching.